Hello, psychology students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have some notes for the beginning of Module 9, and we're going to talk about perception. And to start off, I've got some illusions to share with you. So, if you take a look at this diagram, and if you would happen to be, kind of fairly close to the screen, there are like four dots that are kind of like in the center of your field of vision here. If you would stare at that for about 30 seconds and then tilt your head back, chances are you're going to see an after image. Take some time. You can do this. And when you see that after image, obviously you may feel a little more spiritually enlightened. But in a sense, you are seeing kind of an illusion. And it's how we perceive this that is really kind of the basis of what we're going to talk about in Module 9. So another one that I have for you. It looks like we have two skulls. But what's interesting is the placement of the skull in contrast to the blue and yellow lines. Just so you know, the skull that is pictured in both areas is actually the same color. But what's interesting is when you have the blue lines removed from the right-hand side and you just have yellow, you might perceive this to be a little lighter than on the left-hand side where you have the yellow lines removed and you just have the blue, and you have what you might perceive as being a darker image. But the irony is they're the same. So you can take a moment, look at that. But I'm going to move ahead. And we're going to talk a little bit about perception. And perception is the process of organizing and interpreting incoming sensory information. Now, I'm going to tell you this. It's not perfect. And how one person perceives a stimuli is going to be different than someone else. But we do use similar processes of interpreting this. And so you may have this bottom-up processing, which we talked a little bit about in Module 8, which is when you're taking in raw stimuli and trying to make sense of it. A lot of times it's kind of something that happens when we experience something for the first time, like first time seeing something, first time tasting, smelling, and whatnot. The other process is top-down. And that is when we take this information that we're receiving as stimuli and we're going to compare it to some of our expectations or some of the things that we've committed to our memory. And we're going to try to interpret what that is. So I want to use this diagram below as maybe something to work with. If you stare at this long enough, it's going to cause your mind to go a little nutty because it looks like there's a bunch of dots that are just jumping around between these black squares. But the truth is, there are no dots. And it is how our brain is perceiving this that makes it seem like that this illusion has motion or movement. And in a way, it's kind of like working with the opponent process theory of sight. We've kind of, grouped our light and dark areas together as far as how our rods are working in our eyes, and it just seems to take on movement. And if we would have a colored square, it probably would look like some type of lighter color dot that might be moving around. So if I had purple, it might seem like a lavender square that might be moving. So you can take a look at this. So our perception is formed by innate factors that are built into our brain. We all have these. How we retrieve and how we use might vary from person to person. But in a sense, it is something that we are born with. So let's talk about these great pioneers of Gestalt. And I'm going to move this to the side. There we go. So you can see our founding fathers a little better. But the word Gestalt, which is a term that you might see in psychology, there we go, basically means the whole. It's a German term. And basically, the way we organize patterns that we tend to perceive, Gestalt psychologists emphasize that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And some of our, philosophers slash psychologists were Wolfgang Keeler, Max Wertheimer, and Kurt Koffka. All men and all working in Germany roughly about the turn of the 20th century. So kind of in that 1900 to maybe about 1915 period of time. Gestalt psychologists urge their colleagues to look at the whole, the entirety of the thing that they are working with. And sometimes we get into this idea that the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. That's kind of something that comes out of this. But there are several relationships that they were going to kind of emphasize. One is this relationship between the figure and the background, or figure-ground relationships. It's a way that we group items that seem to be similar, or we can group by proximity, closure, or continuity, as a way to better understand the world around us. So looking at some of these figure-ground diagrams that we have here, this is the way that we can organize our visual fields into objects, which would be figures, and what they stand against, which is basically the background. On the right-hand side, you have kind of what I would call the prototypical, most famous figure-ground diagram. It looks like you have a vase that is there. But if you look at the background, meaning the white, okay, the stuff that isn't standing out, you might see two faces that are kind of looking at one another. Or if you take a look at the item to the left, it looks like you have a man that is walking down steps. But if you look at the white, you might see arrows going up and down, okay? All of this is to help us, kind of see what's around us. So figure is going to draw our attention initially. Typically, that's going to be the darker color that you see here. The ground being the white, this is going to consist of the surrounding aspects. What we don't necessarily anticipate is that there would be motion or some kind of image that would be embedded into the background. And thus, we're kind of, thinking outside of the sum of its parts using our Gestalt. So there are some grouping principles that our Gestalt psychologists like to talk about. Grouping is basically a perceptual tendency to organize stimuli into understandable units. And Gestalt psychologists believe that we were predispositioned to organize stimuli by grouping. And this is kind of how we're going to do this. We're going to group things that look similar. So if we have a group of students that are wearing maybe their uniform on a Friday, we might assume that they're part of a team, okay? Because they all look the same. Or if we have a group of uniformed students in blue or white polos, we might assume that they're Catholic school students, okay? Proximity. This is a word that means proximate. It also means close. So we tend to group things that are kind of close together. We also like to do closure. So if we're looking at, maybe a line that might be broken apart, but it looks like it has a tendency to form a shape, we might close that gap and make it into a shape. So if you remember in elementary school, you probably did a lot of tracing of letters or shapes. In a sense, it's not really a triangle or a square or a circle or the letter A or B. But once you connect those lines, it becomes that shape and it becomes that letter. You're closing the gaps. Continuity. Once an object appears to move in a particular direction, our brain assumes that the movement continues unchanged. So if we're kind of watching from a distance and we see runners running around a track, we have a tendency to kind of follow the direction that they're going, and we assume that at some point in time they're going to cross the finish line. okay? When we talk about a highway, we might see it go off into the distance. We might not see the end of the road, but we assume that it continues to move onward, or a set of train tracks. So that's how we have that continuity. So Gestalt, German word that means whole, form, or configure. Grouping, these are perceptual tendencies of organizing stimuli into meaningful units. So our similarities, are you looking at, you know, triangle, circle, triangle, or are you looking at triangles in a row, circles in a row, triangles in a row? If we're looking at the proximity and we're looking at the lines, do you see 6 lines or do you see 3 pairs of lines? Continuity, do you see just half circles or do you see what looks like a wave? Or closure, do you see just the dotted lines or do you see what might be perceived as shapes? So here we go. Law of similarity, most basic of the grouping, you put things together that look similar. Okay, so again, are you looking horizontally or are you looking up and down? Okay, as far as how you're grouping things. Again, our proximity, are you looking at single lines or pairs of lines? Are you looking at single dots? Are you looking at, you know, dots that seem to form a line? Or if we're looking at our groupings of circles, are you looking at it in terms of, you know, numerous, like 8 circles? Are you in the little one, or are you looking at 6 circles in the bigger? You know, you could also look at the middle dots, just so you know those are exactly the same in size, but you might perceive them as being different sized. Closure, do you see the cube down at the bottom, or do you see just what looks like Pac-Man? Okay, same with the soccer ball. Do you see just the black pentagons, or do you see what might be kind of the shape of maybe a soccer ball? Our continuity, are you following just parts of the line? Are you following the line as it crosses the middle point? You know, and that there is some kind of movement that's unchanging. So, thank you very much.